Multi-hazards, all about protecting communities.
Hi everyone, this is Multi-Hazards, a podcast where we take a deep dive into issues in emergency management, climate change adaptation, security, etc. And ultimately, it's about protection, protecting communities. I'm your host, Vin Nelson. Welcome! Today is a special day. I'm thrilled to have the chance to interview Christine Callihoo. Christine Callihoo is a registered professional planner, RPP, with a Master's of Science. She's a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners, MCIP, and a senior land use and community planner. She has 25 years of experience in a diverse range of areas, including land use and community planning, community-based climate change mitigation and adaptation planning, asset management planning, and community safety planning. With a focus in engagement and policy development, Christine Callihoo brings a climate lens to all project endeavors to increase community resiliency and adaptive capacity. Her recent certifications earned include the following: ISO 31000 Provisional Risk Manager Certificate, a professional certificate in asset management planning from the Institute of Public Works Engineering, Australasia, IPWEA. Her areas of specialization are integrated asset management planning, climate change adaptation / community resiliency planning, and community safety planning. Now, typically here at the Multi-Hazards podcast, out of deep respect for the First Nations, whose land I'm podcasting from, just outside of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, I would like to say a territorial acknowledgement. So I am using the text from Kwantlen Polytechnic University, or KPU, a local post-secondary school. So, here we go. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Kwikwetlam peoples. These are the names of various First Nations groups around me here in Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. Now, without further ado, let's get to the interview. So, hi, Christine. How are you? And how are you doing? And how about you and all the people around you? How are you coping with this current pandemic?
Hey, Vin, Christine. Yeah, I doing well. Well, like everybody else, you're spending a lot of time solo and being strategic in when you're not solo. But you know what? It's the price we pay. It's what we have to do in order to take care of one another. So it's all good.
Right, exactly. Well, things are slowly opening up, and hopefully there's not a big second wave, but we'll see what happens.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Christine, I was reading your bio from various websites, and it looks like you come with such a rich background. And now in this interview, you've indicated that you'd like to focus on some issues that are most urgent and timely, just to keep the focus narrow. So let's just start off with where do you think that climate change, because your background's in especially climate change adaptation, so where do you think climate change and adaptation are headed?
Well, finally headed, I believe, in a much better direction than previously under previous federal governments. I do believe
here in Canada, of course.
In Canada specifically, yes. Well, and we're seeing in Europe as well. People are catching on that we can't just focus it on mitigation. And I understand why humans want to. It's because that's where they can make money, right? They can continue with the current economic paradigm, whereas adaptation is an investment.
Right.
And it's a long-term investment. It's an investment in things that we often don't consider monetary investment value, i.e. our communities and our humans that exist within them. So I am seeing that paradigm shift. And as you know, Vin, I spend quite a bit of time in the asset management realm, and that was very strategic on my part, because from when I got into climate change adaptation work specifically as a community and land use planner was when the Canadian Institute of Planners put out a request for applications amongst the membership to work in the Arctic with Nunavut communities developing climate change adaptation plans, because of course they have been seeing the change for decades, much more significantly than elsewhere in Canada. And of course now over the years it's trickled down. And now we're seeing the manifestation of these impacts here. Starting there, it was the focus was on adaptation just because it's already happening. And also, to be quite frank, the Nunavut communities have nothing to do with our climate change predicament we're in now. They're just feeling it, as are all other countries, southern countries, right? They contributed very little to the predicament, but are unduly impacted by it. So asset management, in my mind, is a way for a community to comprehensively take a look at adaptation and mitigation. They go together, right? Low carbon resiliency is the term. And so that's an area that I've been in, and I see great progress where we can, asset management allows communities to pull in that layer of information, climate change. They also allow communities to pull in that beautiful layer that's been completely neglected, which is our natural assets that support human settlements everywhere, well, humans in general, through ecosystem services. So in my mind, we are not screaming ahead, but we're certainly moving ahead at a really nice pace. And what is advantageous about asset management and adaptation planning, and when you bring those together, is you are building resilience, which addresses to some degree the pandemic. So I can understand why people, and I don't know, Vin, if you've noticed of late, that there are a whole number of webinars being offered looking at COVID resiliency and then making that parallel extension to climate change adaptation and building our preparedness. It all comes together, and it really needs to. And what's lovely about it all is that those tools and those frameworks are already out there. We don't need to create anything to empower communities to move forward. Really what we need to do is support them. Support them through capacity, resources, including funds, and really wherever they need support is really the role of the practitioner, the planning, engineering, architectural, and otherwise practitioners to support these communities. So the tools are there. So I am feeling a lot more optimistic than perhaps I was during the Harper regime.
Now, I actually, myself, I took, I would say, let's see, from University of Waterloo, 4 graduate courses in climate change and then a couple at Yukon University.
Nice.
But I didn't actually see asset management in there. And I had always thought this is something from, one of the Canadian banks, right? This is more like a financial management type of thing. So could we back up and just talk about what exactly, in the context of climate change adaptation, what is asset management planning?
Beautiful question, Vin. Thank you very much for bringing that to the fore, because no doubt other folks will have the same question. Asset management planning is all things human development. So everything we build is an asset. And we have to maintain it. So where the Achilles heel has been across the world was right after World War II, of course, the boom, because infrastructure needed to be built. So there was incredible investment around the world, but certainly within North America and Europe, developing bridges, roads, community centers, hospital, you name it. So think those are our assets. But and we have not maintained them properly, right? We build them, and a lot of it it's not because people chose not to. It just wasn't on the periphery, like not even on the periphery, never mind in front of us. So over the years, and certainly in the last 15 years, asset management has become a recognized I guess, profession or sector or area of expertise, because it takes, so you're talking about inventories in asset management. Inventories include all built structures, linear structures, so roads. It includes parks. It includes, right, because everything needs to be managed. So staff. So you do your inventory. So what we're doing now with natural assets are we're incorporating them. So we have Trout Lake here in East Van. That is an asset, one.
So that's East Vancouver just for our international listeners in British
East
Columbia,
Vancouver,
Canada.
British Columbia, Canada. That's right. Thanks, Vin. Yes, and so 3 blocks away we have Trout Lake. That should be included in your asset inventory for a number of reasons. One, it's backup. It's also flood control, right? When there's excessive rain, everything pools into our ponds, our lakes. But if we drain those, which we have, and then built there or built right around them, which humans have done, right everywhere there's water, humans will settle for good reason. We now have impacted the natural asset, and the services they provide are impacted. So that's why we need to get them into the inventory. So an inventory is just simply, what do we have?
Right. And oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that. So a lot of this infrastructure in Canada and many countries were built right after, say, World War II. And doesn't it have like a 70-year span? Nice. And we're past that now.
We certainly, and that is the challenge, right? That is why we are seeing this municipalities. We see it all the time in the news. Crying out for more federal funding because they have infrastructure, not collapse, but certainly a shortage of infrastructure, right? As we're seeing schools, hospitals, just all of our civic buildings are degraded. And right, assets decline over time. But you know what? When you maintain them through a maintenance plan, because you have an inventory, you can often make assets last longer. But you're right, Ben. We are at the end of life for most of that post-World War II. And so in a lot of places, like the ones that we cite often is Montreal and their bridge issues, they need to be replaced, right? And that is happening all across Canada, just because Montreal's had some bridge failures. And they're catastrophic. And not only that, but it impacts how people feel confident about their civil services, right? We pay for that. That's our tax dollars. And so that's another thing that I really like to talk about asset management, is it's driven by levels of service. What do people need? What do they expect? And what can our taxes afford? But we never get to have that conversation. And I think without that conversation, because when people demand more, they have to immediately realize they need to pay more taxes. Taxes are beautiful. They're wonderful. It's we're able to take care of each other and all that we own. But everyone has this bad attitude about taxes when they're absolutely essential. And I love taxes. I just wish politicians would spend them more strategically. But I understand there's a need for taxes. And these are the reasons why. They provide for each of us the things we need and often what we want.
Right. In North America, it seems like, it's of course between left, right, and centralist politics, but we seem to have a pretty bad attitude toward taxes and government in general. We're always like the big bad government. George Orwell, 1984, they're going to get us. But in Europe, for example, and I know specifically in the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, I've seen surveys online where there's a lot more confidence in the government and a lot more positive attitude toward taxes because people know they're getting more bang for their buck. They are paying high taxes, but the taxes are public money and it comes back to people in the form of infrastructure, services, programs, etc. So maybe we need a kind of a mental repair job here in North America to kind of change our attitude, especially with climate change, because the bills will not stop coming in when it comes to extreme weather events.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point, but also take a look at their school system. Vin, they teach critical thinking. North America, unfortunately, the gutting of our public school system has resulted in, and I'm going to make a specific point about the U.S., the undervaluing of our teachers in our school systems and the hyper investment in private by the 5% has resulted in entire generations of non-critical thinkers. In Europe, that is not the case. And in the Scandinavian countries you mentioned, that is not the case. Take a look at how they teach their children. They are critical thinkers. They're encouraged to critically think. So they understand why taxes are necessary, and they can make decisions based on that. In North America, I'm going to say right wing, even though I think that's kind of an obtuse term, but at the same time, it's one that we all recognize. So it's a shared language. Just because what I mean by obtuse term in that it doesn't say enough. It doesn't describe really what it is that we're talking about. But for right now, that's fine. There has been and this has been shown. Just listen to some of the great thinkers like Noam Chomsky, where he can show you step by step how North America, but specifically the U.S., has diminished public education access and quality, and with a deliberate intent to diminish opposition by those that would demand more for their communities, so that the almighty dollar trumps. No pun intended.
Right. And well, Canada, we're kind of stuck in the middle between, say, Europe and maybe a lot of Asian influence, and then the U.S., and they influence us a lot in our own politics. I mean, I was jogging a few days ago and I saw a big protest on this freeway overpass, and all these people were saying, jail our prime minister, and they were hanging the Canadian flag upside down, and and they were seniors. I think they retired, and I was shocked. I was thinking, wow, we're getting this kind of anti-lockdown protest, in a small form here in Vancouver, Canada, just like in the U.S. So, yeah, we do get a lot of American influence, whatever's happening. Luckily, we kind of have our own way of thinking. We do look at Europe and Asia and other places. So, well,
and I am so pleased that Canada is more European than we will ever be. United States thinking. I'm glad that we continue to look to Europe for progressive policy, right? Because when I draft policy, I look to Europe and the Scandinavian countries, as you've mentioned, because and of course, New Zealand, certainly not Australia. Australia is just, southern Alberta. Sorry, Australia. I know you guys. At one point, we used to look at them, especially from an emergency preparedness perspective. They're quite the leaders, but they're also quite the leaders in asset management. Mm-hmm. So we do look to them for that. But generally speaking, it's Europe, and I'm quite pleased about that, because they're the ones that have incredible history and critical thinking capacity.
Wow. Yeah, that's exactly what we need now. Now, especially when you think about this COVID-19 pandemic. And now it's kind of, I think everybody's wondering, where are we going to end up? And that's assuming that there will be an end. It might be lingering in many forms later on, but this is the middle of 2020, and we're still kind of in the thick of it, even though some places are recovering and opening. But the death rate in some places, like, for example, Quebec, Ontario in Canada, and some parts of the U.S., some other parts of the world like Brazil and I think it's Peru and maybe Russia, the death rates and the COVID cases are going up. But this pandemic, it really will affect everything, like how much money governments have to spend, individuals, groups. So where do you think after this pandemic has dissipated, where do you think we will end up in terms of climate change adaptation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Ben. And I almost would like the dialogue to go towards community resiliency and just plop it right there. Everything under that, it addresses pandemics, it addresses emergency planning, because increased drought and wildfires, water security, food security. So I'm hoping all of that will land under community resiliency. And I see it through FCM, Federation of Canadian Municipalities. It's an amazing pressure group. They've got great tools. If anybody out there wants to take a look at community resiliency, asset management, natural assets, etc., take a look at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities website. Incredible tools available. And so I see it where I see it going is a lot of catch up. It's always about catch up, right? Because we're not prepared. We're not prepared for anything, actually. We have been living fairly privileged lives since the end of World War II, and it shows. Because as you'll know, some of the interviews we've had with our elders and how, they can talk about having to be in isolation for how many years was it? Like in some places in Europe, some people lived like this for extended periods of time. Like one fella cited 3 years, carefully moving around, scraping by, having next to nothing. So they remember this and they have some of those tools, but of course we're not paying attention to our knowledge holders, as is obvious. But in terms of moving forward, I hope we tap into that knowledge base. I hope that we continue with our asset management outreach and awareness, which has been going on in Canada vigilantly, assertively for the last 5 years, because people now get that if you have good asset management in your community, good comprehensive asset management, you are prepared. You are prepared because
Right.
you have accounted for pandemics, you have accounted for climate change, you have incorporated your natural assets, so now you have a much bigger asset base. So when things come out, and part of asset management is doing risk analysis. In fact, that is what asset management is, risk management. So if every community with their community members as part of that journey invested in comprehensive asset management, we would be able to address whatever comes at us because it builds our resiliency. It is that simple. I just find people are so keen to create yet another tool so that they can put their name on it, or create a whole new framework. And you know what? Every time I look at these new ones, it is exactly the planning process. So asset management planning, land use planning, community planning, any planning, all these tools emulate it. There is nothing new, people. Use the tools that are there so that people are already familiar with them, so they won't resist them. Because we resist change, we resist difference, right? We need to sniff at it, get to know it. Whereas these tools, and all we're saying is, hey, why don't you add this layer and this layer? And this is how we're doing it. And this is how you can use it. And they're like, okay, cool, yeah, got it. And they're off the races. Versus the stopping, hey, we need training. We don't know what this is. It slows things down, so it slows down resiliency building.
Right. Now, I've seen that because myself, I've trained in emergency management and climate change adaptation, but it seems there's a lot of tools, there's a lot of instruction that applies to both fields, and they may do it just slightly differently, but it's very much the same, and I don't see that much collaboration happening at this point, just a tiny bit, but it could go much, much further. And I know you've looked. I know your career is in climate change adaptation, but you've also done some emergency management in the city of Vancouver, I believe, right?
I am a volunteer with the city of Vancouver through Vancouver Volunteer Corp with the emergency support services. So I lead Zone C, which is East Vancouver, and my team and I, and of course that's been we don't meet for right now, but since I think 2015, we meet every month and we do exercises with the city and the fire department. So I'm fairly well trained over the last 6 years. So yeah, I would say that, and you know what, Ben, what an astute observation on your part, and how emergency planning and climate change adaptation absolutely need to be working hand in hand because they speak the same language almost. I mean, there's some terms that are slightly different, but we can get to know each other. The frameworks are there in terms of response. One's a bit different, you're right, as you've said. But those two really, and so I've been saying it. And in fact, when I see this resistance on both sides, when I would go to climate change adaptation engagements, dialogues, like through SFU ACT-PAC, Adaptation Climate Change Team, Professional Advisory Committee, I would say, well, the first step, because when we talk about climate change and what's coming at us and projections, people are like, and they get scared. And what do we do when we get scared? We turtle, right?
Right.
We go to our happy place. And so then I realized people are shutting down around me as I'm trying to work with them to enable and support resiliency. So then I took a step back and I went, they need to feel empowered so they don't turtle. So I said, how many folks here are able to remain in place unaided for 3 days minimum? Who has a home preparedness kit? And that is what got me into emergency planning and response. It was that I realized I need to bring that layer in because no one had it. So what we did was we went after some funding. We got all the materials. Then we had a community gathering. Everybody came out, shared their stories, and then they all lined up with their containers and they all got stuff for their containers based on this list. And then we talked about how to store it. And then they were like, okay, so about this climate change stuff, we can go on to that now. Because I was able to address immediate uncertainty. They go hand in hand.
Right. Right. Now, what do you see as your role as a registered professional planner, that's an RPP, related to climate change going forward?
In my mind, then planners, registered professional planners, so urban planners, local government planners, community planners, land use planners, it's just everyone has to have these differences when in fact we are all planners.
Right.
We are precursors to everything else. So every plan, design, zoning bylaw, special use, all that we are essentially the gatekeepers. We're not, because of course council trumps us all the time. But anyways, planners are at the forefront of everything human development. We need to be at the table. We need to be at least co-leading or as senior advisors. It's not the engineers. The engineers come in and pick up our plans. And really, that is an appalling part of our planning and engineering paradigm, just if I may, Ben, really quick, is we are not planning communities together. Accountants, finance, housing, parks, engineers, and planners all need to be at the table with the community to make these plans, to make them feasible. Too often planners create things that engineers then pick up and go, are you kidding me? How the heck are we supposed to make this work? And then they jimmy with it, right? They get their allowances, their etc. So planners are paramount in the climate change adaptation realm, in the community resiliency, enabling and supporting. We are absolutely essential. And what I don't get is how no one even knows what a community planner is. I don't know how many times I've said, people are like, oh, so what do you do? I'm a community planner. Oh, so is that like in finance or like, no. Everything around you has to be planned by someone, by a team. Oh, yeah, I guess, hey? It's amazing. But we precurse everything. So we need to be at the table. And I say it all the time. Do you have a planner at your table? Then you have an amazing gap. Because planners, unfortunately, if we don't know the context and the story and the desire and the thought that went behind it, we can actually impede wonderful policy because we're sticking to the book instead of going, oh, yeah, I guess that doesn't fit. Oh, and I totally understand and empathize what you guys are doing. And yeah, there needs to be something. So let's work together to make that happen. And we get municipalities that do that. Great staff that are willing to step outside of their box and go, oh, yeah, what is going on here? Well, let's figure this out. But if we're not at the table, havoc is wreaked. And as we're seeing throughout North America and how we build and continue to sprawl, there's a huge disconnect.
Right. And planners are one of the paramount professions in climate change adaptation. And I was even wondering, this field is quite new. Like there was a document from, say, the U.S., I think it was the Krisky, hope I'm pronouncing right, Foundation. They were asking a question about 5 years ago, is this I think it was 3 years. Is this a field actually? Because if you go on LinkedIn, you go on Indeed.com, these job search websites, you can see, well, some of the climate adaptation jobs are, say, for engineers, for healthcare experts, well, not so much educators, but insurance professionals, but a lot of urban planners. Yeah. So it seems to be a conglomerate of many different fields, not an actual field unto itself. But there's the American Society for Adaptation Professionals.
Oh, right, yeah.
And then there was a conference in Vancouver, I think back in February, called Adaptation 2020. So it looks like there are conferences, webinars. There's a sort of a loose group of people from many different professions who are dealing with climate change adaptation. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, the Adaptation 2020 is so I was on the committee, and it was that was the Fraser Basin Council that led that on behalf of a whole number of parties, including the Planning Institute of BC, the Simon Fraser University Adaptation Climate Change Team Professional Advisory Committee, as well as the Professional Association Adaptation Working Group through SFU Act. Like, there's a whole number of groups. That was very deliberate. We had, right from the get-go, so 2015, we were all brought together, and I often represent the Planning Institute of BC. I'm kind of their go-to person to sit on these tables, just because that is my background, climate change. And we recognized from that point forward, if we're going to have a fulsome, comprehensive dialogue about climate change, low carbon resiliency, which is mitigation and adaptation together, to avoid redundancy and resource wastage. So we recognized there was no lawyers around the table. There was no finance, accounting. We had foresters, biologists, and an agrologist, a planner, engineers, and then we deliberately went out and got those folks, because we can't have a full dialogue about adaptation without everyone at the table that influences that, supports it, and enables it. And so when that conference was designed, it was with that in mind, and it was to make those connections.
Right.
And I do believe they were quite successful at it.
Right. Now, in our context of Canada, and I think we're quite similar to, say, Russia and some of the Northern European countries, anybody who's kind of up north.
Yep.
What are the priority risks for Canada? Now, for example, we could say drought or rural-urban interface fires, extreme weather events, heat waves, flooding, sea level rise, etc. So what are our particular risks here that we need to be dealing with? Yeah.
Generally speaking, all of Canada, flooding, wildfire. And of course, our 3 coasts, two coasts, sea level rise, because the North Coast is still rebounding from the last glacial period. So as their sea rises, it's actually the land is rising. So yeah, I would say it's water security and food security predominantly. So because as a macro thinker, then I always think high, and then I can start chiseling down in terms of detailing what each one of those are. But water security in my mind is paramount. And water security includes the ability to respond to emergencies. So having water on hand to respond to fire. And making sure at all times that it works. Again, asset management, right? Manage those assets that you are counting on to be prepared. So overland flooding is probably the most, I can't say the most expensive now, can I? Because of the wildfires in northern Alberta was our most expensive. So it's drought, wildfire, and overland flooding. Due to extreme weather, extreme and more frequent weather events, which all show a trend in terms of climate change, right? I mean, weather is not climate, etc.
Right. And climate change, just for our listeners, that climate is basically 30 years of weather records.
Long term,
but,
yeah.
Yeah, but climate change is, it does affect all of these extreme weather events, etc., in terms of frequency, in terms of magnitude. Now, in addressing climate risk and supporting resiliency, which basically means we could just define it as getting tougher and bouncing back when things happen. But you were mentioning before in an email to me about risk and vulnerability assessment. What is that?
Oh, that's the baseline to all planning, I hope. Like, I hope everyone is doing, every planner, every engineer is doing that for every planning process. And that's really, it's taking a look at what you have, identifying vulnerabilities, creating an action plan to address that. It really is that simple. Sorry, it's that basic. It's never simple, right? As soon as you say, why don't you just know that you should hush, because nothing is just. Everything is quite the task. But it really is knowing what you have, knowing the state it's in, and then planning ahead and addressing the gaps. That's the big one, right? Because and what we run into in terms of emergency planning response is the gaps are not sexy. They're not politically glittery. I.e., we need training. We don't need cans. We don't need, people want to buy equipment, but no one wants to invest in the people, right? Because what are your checks and balances? You buy cans and you check it off and you're good. Training people is an ongoing thing unless there's an action to respond to. You can't actually know how well you're doing. I mean, you can. There's evaluation tools out there. It's just, bureaucrats don't often take the time. But it's all part of that. Like, risk and vulnerability is, your vulnerability is all your gaps. Your risk is what you've calculated, right? Like, and you know what? Anyone can do that calculation, even generally. And we do it all the time, every day, if I dare say. We're all risk assessors. We just need to recognize the formal steps if we want to apply them. But every time I have that conversation with folks and we walk through it, we do a scenario, they're like, oh yeah, we do this. I know you do. I'm just giving you a shared language, so that when you chat about it, other people will know what you're saying. And then you can have that shared language dialogue, right?
Right.
But we all do it, Ben.
Mm-hmm. And how do we prepare and plan? Like, basically, we were talking about the infrastructure, for example, is based on World War II until now, 70 years. But for climate change, it's the wild card. It's bringing some things in that are kind of unknowable. So how do we prepare and plan for that, knowing that climate change is kind of like this speeding train, and we really don't know which track it's going to take?
But we do, Ben. We do. Generally speaking, I know it sounds arrogant. It's not meant to. But generally speaking, every community I go into, I know generally, just looking at basic projections from stellar institutes like PECIC and PECS. What is it? The Pacific acronyms, right? As soon as you use them all the time, you forget what they mean. But anyways, PECIC and perhaps you could put the link up with the sound bite. But I can go into a community, and I do every time. I get a sense of where they're at, and of course read their journey, their stories, so their plans, their economic development strategies, their whatever. I get their story, and I bring in that layer of climate change. And generally speaking, it's drought, wildfire, including within settlements, right? Because we'll have dead standing trees because we planted for a certain climate that is changing. Like in Vancouver, in Metro Van, what we're seeing is a lot of stressed cedars because they are surface root. When there's so much moisture coming down, these trees do so well. And of course, in our region with the rain, they do great. But with the increase in long periods of no rain that we're seeing more and more each year, we're seeing stressed cedar. Well, that cedar is going to eventually die. And we're going to have large stands, especially in our green spaces, of dead standing trees, which are fire hazards. So we need to get in there as a community. And that's why you can do Fire Safe for Homes and Fire Safe for Communities. Check that out. It's a great program for anybody to use. But I can generally know as a planner, and I've told this to the planning institute, the membership, we already have the tools. Don't wait. We have the tools. Get projections. Generally speaking, it's drought. So plan for that. How is their water? Do they have a water backup? That's redundancy. That's resiliency. Are they prepared for fires? Do they know about Fire Smart? Are they practicing Fire Smart? What do they need in order to engage and move forward with Fire Smart? Other one is overland flooding. Take a look at where they plan to build, right? And you get that in the OCP and in their strategy, and advise them, right? If that's a hazardous area, it's not going to be popular. And in fact, that's where planners get shouted down by council, is when we start talking about why are we building in high hazard areas? We know these are high hazard areas. And then bring in that climate projection lens, and that vulnerability increases significantly. So there are a number of ways in which the risk analysis informs community planning and how you can bring in that climate change layer. And we already have. We have what we need to move forward. Is it perfect? No, but we can never as humans wait for perfect information, because there is no such thing. I would say more RPPs, due diligence requires us to bring in the climate change lens.
Right, exactly. Now, in Vancouver, just to let our international listeners know, people call our city Vancouver, or we call it ourselves. There was this. I remember there's this. What was it? It was like a GIF or GIF, or whatever you call those things. It was a graphic, and it said Vancouver in spring, and it had rain, and it had a bear with an umbrella. Vancouver in summer, Vancouver in fall, Vancouver in winter. And it was all the same graphic. But they call it Vancouver. But I remember 2 years ago, was it 2 or 3? And it just wouldn't rain. I was like, what's going on? Spring, so many months, summer. It's like, what's going on? And there was a drought that was extending all the way up from, what was it, California, Oregon, Washington State in America, all the way up to British Columbia here in Canada. And I was kind of shocked. I was like, in my whole life here, I've never seen a real drought. You have to sort of go to the Okanagan at the U.S.-Canada border to see that little desert there that creeps up from Washington State into Canada. But drought, it's kind of shocking. And then the trees drying out like that,
absolutely.
that really could spark into wildfires, and then windstorms, and you're out jogging. There was a woman jogging last year. I think it was in the west end of Vancouver, and a big tree blew over, and it took out a fence, and she got trapped by a fence, and the neighbor heard her kind of moaning and screaming underneath the fence, and he got out his chainsaw and rescued her. But we never really saw these kind of things in Vancouver before. So this is I can't even say the new normal. We could say the new abnormal.
Well, for sure. So those are weather events. And with climate change, what we're seeing is it's ramping up in intensity and frequency. So that's the climate change over the long term. And because, of course, we've had wind storms in Vancouver since, time began. We've had drought periods as well. But what we're finding is that they're happening more often and are happening for longer periods of time. And the impacts are, as you stated, is the stressed vegetation. But also, we were restricted from our water reservoir, right? It got down to a level that we hadn't seen before. So in terms of watering anything, drawing on water, I welcome those events because it gets us into the mindset of, whoa, like you said, what's going on here? I don't understand. So it gets on the everyday person's radar that there's something going on. They don't know what it is. And some are not willing to consider climate change. It doesn't matter. Are you prepared for a wildfire? It can happen at any time. And yes, we're anticipating more frequent, et cetera, but for the everyday person. And so that's what gets them starting to think about, well, maybe I should take a look at home proofing, fire smarting my home. Go online, Fire Smart Homes. It gives you all the step-by-step. Fire Smarting the community. Check it out. But that is the trend that we are seeing, and that is our new normal.
Right. And just kind of extending this here, I was reading about California and the wildfires there, and they were saying that because the cost of housing in, say, San Francisco, Los Angeles, other places has been going up over the years, that people have been motivated to go and build and develop in the hills, in the mountain areas. So it's kind of bringing people and infrastructure closer to the forests. And I see that here in Vancouver. Everything's getting so expensive in this area. And it's like, well, people want to develop and move to these kind of areas where there's not much infrastructure. There are not many fire departments serving them. And it's kind of a risky situation. And it's being impacted by economics.
And, I really wish this is where comprehensive asset management would come in, Vin. If we had the opportunity to actually calculate for the regular taxpayer how much that sprawl costs us, up into, without minimal services, the homeowner who chooses to do that is doing so on the bankroll of the taxpayer, because they are not paying the true costs. We would have far less of this sprawl if people actually paid the true cost of it. But it's a burden that we all pay, including those that don't own. Asset management, comprehensive asset management, integrated asset management would allow us to have that conversation and would allow us to show how much it truly costs and put that property at its true cost long term for that person to choose to live out there.
Right. And is it the fault of the individual, or could you say it's more the fault of developers and municipalities who greenlight these projects?
I don't think is an applied term here. We are all complicit in that we do not make sure we know what's really going on.
Right. We don't do research.
Right. Well, and including council members that approve these things. If they were actually presented with the true costs in council with the community members there, and the community members are going, well, wait a minute, so if you rezone that area and they build there, it's going to cost us how much? No, I'm not voting for. No, council, you are not allowing that. We are densifying in order to keep our costs down. But it really, it's the framework that allows it. And if we were more informed as a community of people across the planet about how much this stuff actually costs us, including using fossil fuels, if we actually knew how much they cost us, health, ecologically, as well as extractively, just the actual act of getting it out of the ground, we subsidize. If we actually started to, and integrated asset management allows us to bring those actual costs in so that we are making true decisions and making astute risk assessment and management decisions. It pains me. So whose fault is it? It's all of us. We're all complicit because we have not really thought about, since after the war, what the heck we're doing. It's really laissez-faire. It's individually oriented where, no, I want this. I can pay for it, so I'm going to do it. It's like, no, dude, actually, we're in this together. Right. Exactly. But we don't have that mindset, right? So fault it's just not a helpful term. It's more, who are the players in this decision-making process? What is the information that they have at hand? Is it sufficient? And I say no. And how are they making those decisions? Okay, so where are the gaps?
Right, exactly. Now, at the end, when you've done all these calculations, is there like kind of a fancy technical term for, say, an all-inclusive cost?
Well, no. Not that I'm aware of.
Well, you can make up one.
Well, I perhaps there's merit to create a new column of all-inclusive cost, and then some kind of a definition where you say ecological, social, economic, that sort of thing. The actual cost is this, and then you put it in the spreadsheet. That would be super duper.
Right. I took a course in sustainability reporting, and I think they they have something like that. I don't know.
It's pretty vague, though. And the problem with being in the sustainability realm is that things are still quite general. Some of the things where I'm seeing really neat and welcomed work is within finance and insurance and the valuation of our natural assets. The recent one, the one I was just reading, and it was just, I couldn't believe it. I was just like, oh yeah, we are moving ahead. It's a conceptual framework to understand the business case for eco-health. And really what they're doing is they're developing a monetary valuing way for human health benefits of green space. But you can see how that could expand out to include other things. But really, it's a conceptual framework within the business case model for values that currently are not accounted for. So they're literally putting a monetary value to the physical exercise that people get from green space, social engagement, lowering urban noise and heat, mitigating for air pollutants and flooding. And once we have those numbers, Vin, we could literally do those complete price or expansive price or actual price.
Right. So the cost benefit analysis really needs to include way more, or maybe be totally redefined.
Absolutely. Climate-related health risks need to be in there, right? Air pollutants. More people die around the world due to air pollution than any other cause. But yet, and we all generally know that. We know air pollution is brutal for us. But we have accepted the narrative that fossil fuels are integral to our the quality of life in which we know and love. That is absolutely false. That's a narrative that has been created and perpetuated by those with an interest in doing so. Our quality of life can manifest in many ways with many supports, including and not limited to renewable energy. I also think there's rationale for us to rethink how we live and what we deem to be priorities. And the one thing about the pandemic that has done that is given that moment of pause in a rat race for people to go, because of course, my Trout Lake, I have never seen so many people use Trout Lake, and it was always a popular park. It's a beautiful park. But the level of use, people now see why we need green spaces and more of them. One, as emergency planner, those are our muster areas. Those are our backup sheltering areas. Those are our, come together, gain a green plan and get out there and help the community areas. As well as if you live in an apartment with no AC in the summer when there's extreme heat, you go into the park and get under a tree and you cool down. So they're essential too. They offset the costs of hospitalization and exposure to the negative impacts. They serve so many things, but without a way to evaluate them in a monetary way, because money is the only shared language we have around the world. Everybody gets money, right? Exactly. The dollar. And so we need to get it in a language that we all can share, we can all calculate. So a lot of people resist monetarizing our green spaces, but I don't think we can get around it. And I know at one point, I believe, when I took environmental economics in, 1997, it's been a while, that was certainly one thing that we talked about was it has inherent value. It is what it is because it is. Okay, but that's not helpful, and that's not going to be part of the narrative of moving forward to build resiliency unless we have a shared language, and that is monetary.
Right. Now, just kind of shifting the subject here, if there are people who are looking into, say, asset management or urban planning or climate change adaptation, what advice could you give to young people or middle-aged career changers who are looking to work in these fields?
Oh, lovely. Well, as it happens, I make that pitch fairly often when I lecture at SFU, at Simon Fraser University. And I'm there doing community resiliency by applying integrated asset management and natural assets. But that's very much what I'm doing is saying, get into adaptation. But, you can do it. I recommend, and I'm talking to planning students, so I'm recommending these planners not be sustainability planners. Because I'll always ask at the beginning of the class, who here is planning on being a sustainability planner? And I always get a few hands. And then I say, who here is planning to be an environmental planner. And I always get a few hands. And I'm like, please don't. and everyone's like, what? And I'm like, humans don't recognize. Like, to this day, I know so many sustainability planners, and whenever they tell people what they do, people are like, oh, right, yeah. No one knows what to do with you, including in government. You're always the extra off the side of the desk. So you're the first one that gets laid off when things get tight because you're an extra. You're an add-on. Whereas if you were an asset management planner, you bring in that sustainability lens right into it, and you do it strategically, deliberately, and there's phases within the asset management planning process that speaks to it deliberately. Environmental planners, no, do asset management planning because you bring that right in deliberately and strategically, and I'm going to show you how. So go into planning, but be strategic. If you're keen on adaptation, like climate change adaptation and mitigation, so low carbon resiliency, and you want to bring that into what you do, and you're also keen on sustainability and the natural environment, absolutely bring that into it. All of that belongs under integrated asset management in my mind.
Right. So are there specific programs for that, say in Canada, US, or other countries?
So there is, Vince, but they are still not. So I serve on the federal technical working group for asset management. So we meet in Ottawa, and last time was Halifax. And that is my objective when I go there, is to bring in that climate change and natural asset layer, because when they all come together, they are talking about hard infrastructure. They are and which is absolutely fine. These asset managers, often from engineering, are there to improve the practice of asset management.
Right.
So my interest, which is wonderful, because it really it's a maturing area of expertise that is absolutely paramount to enabling and supporting community resiliency. It's absolutely paramount. So the next step, so it's new. It's relatively new. There is a little bit of resistance, but not much compared to planners, where I say, let's bring in the climate change. And others are of similar mind. But it's okay, how are we going to do that? So now we're there. So if folks are looking to just dive into an area, a degree or a program of study that immediately does integrated asset management with natural assets and climate change, it's not there yet. But hang out with me, hang out with us, tag along, inform, learn alongside us. I did I attained my professional certificate in asset management planning through the Institute of Public Works Engineering in Australia.
Oh, okay.
Because Australia is a leader in asset management, as well as a number of other places. But they really do come to the fore, and it was just such a really good program, and it's done remotely. But they've set it up in such a way that you feel engaged. You are talking with your class members. So that's why I chose that one. It was extremely challenging. I was a bit surprised, actually.
Wow, okay.
But It was so informative. And it really provided that foundation. And of course, I've been working with the Yukon government doing pilots as to how integrated asset management works for rural remote communities with limited capacity. And so we've done 3 pilots so far. I've learned lots from that. And really, one of the foundational requirements is their needs. So that's why if you just focus in on asset management planning as it is, hone your skills, be aware of all the other stuff, that would be great, because the capacity and the understanding of asset management across Canada is not there. It needs to be, and there's a great effort and interest to do so. So people are scrambling to learn from each other and formally. So again, Federation of Canadian Municipalities has Asset Management 101. Check it out. Yeah, and I do believe it's at no cost. I could be wrong, but I hope not. But they have a load of stuff on there. So there are a number of avenues, Vin, and I welcome folks following up and asking how they can tap in. But right now, we are the bleeding edge of integrated asset management with climate change and natural assets in mind.
Right. Well, I know for climate change adaptation, for example, I was looking online for Canada. It seems like there's one undergrad degree in the Maritimes. I can't remember if it's New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. But in Australia, as you were saying, there's one university. They're preparing an online master's in climate change adaptation. So I hope a lot of these places around the world will start developing more education. And because of COVID-19, I think a lot of schools will be motivated to do online programs because they're seeing value in it.
Absolutely. I agree. There's great merit to it.
Now, are there any other guests do you think you could recommend for the Multi-Hazards program here?
How about if I just say absolutely? There are people that I could recommend.
Okay, we'll talk later, but that is awesome.
Thanks,
that is awesome. Great. Yeah, there's a lot of awesome people who are working in
there
this. Now, is there anything else you'd like to leave with the listeners? If you had like one important message that you'd like to leave with people.
Yes. Please develop your critical thinking skills. We all assume that we know what is right and what needs to happen, and just know that chances are we're probably a little off or wrong altogether. Let's check our assumptions. Let's turn on our critical thinking skills and, based on what, according to whom, where's the information coming from? What is their motivation in providing it? I think the biggest Achilles heel for humans right now is that we have become lazy in our learning with social media, with online media. We step away from that, ask questions, engage in tough dialogues that make you uncomfortable. I guess the one thing, the adage that I live by is let's get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because when we're uncomfortable, we learn the most. So if we're in a space that we don't understand, we don't know, enjoy it. Know that you are learning an immense amount of stuff. But yeah, please be critical. Please don't just listen and regurgitate. Ask questions, get involved, volunteer with organizations that are involved with the climate change and community resiliency. No doubt there's an emergency preparedness effort in your community. Get involved. That's all part of building community resiliency, is knowing your neighbor, knowing all your gifts and strengths, and who to draw upon when you need them. It's less about very specific things, Vin. It's more general, and that is we have a lot of work to do on ourselves. Check our egos. We are so ego-driven that it impedes our ability to learn from each other. Be kind to one another. Yes, some people, like some of the stuff that comes out of my mouth, sometimes I wonder what the hell I'm thinking. Can we just be kind? All bumping about and learning. Every day we're learning. No one's perfect. There's just no such thing. And we need to be aware of that, always reminding ourselves. And you know what? We all love our babies. We all love our families. We all love our communities, and we all want what's best for them and our communities. None of us are different in that way. So can we start there with our similarities and build on that with respect and kindness?
Right. Thank you so much, Christine. I really appreciate it. And I've seen your posts on Twitter, and I've seen online that you've been doing a lot of webinars and lectures at Simon Fraser University's ACT program. So I know you're deeply involved in climate change adaptation and asset management and getting people up to speed on preparation. So I want to thank you for coming into our podcast today, and I just hope you have a wonderful week.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's been an absolute pleasure. And folks, as I said, follow up at any time. Let's keep the conversation going. And Ben, you rock. Thanks so much for all that you do. Getting it out there. It's absolutely essential. People like you are some of the most invested people in our community. We need folks like you. So thanks so much, Ben.
Great. Thank you. All right. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Wonderful interview. I really enjoyed that. Really. Very informative. Thanks again to Christine Callihoo for being a guest here at the Multi-Hazards podcast. So here's a little disclaimer that I add to the end of each episode nowadays, and it is, this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific advice unless otherwise noted. Also, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that the host, that's me, or guests are part of. So, here at the conclusion of this episode, I'd like to say thanks to all of you, each one of you, for listening. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.